After meeting with EU leaders, Sir Keir Starmer declared he'd secured a win-win deal to reset the UK's post-Brexit relationship. Measures include a new security partnership, which will give British firms access to a €150 billion defence fund. A cutting of red tape will allow for more food exports, but EU standards will need to be followed. Queues at airports will be cut, with British passport holders allowed to use eGates. But perhaps most controversially, EU fishermen's access to British waters has been extended for an additional 12 years. For the Prime Minister, the deal as a whole showed that Britain was back on the world stage, but the Conservative leader claimed it was taking the country backwards.
A new partnership between an independent Britain and our allies in Europe. This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market, the best of any country outside of the EU or EFTA, all while sticking to the red lines in our manifesto about not rejoining the single market, the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement. So this deal is good for both sides. It's time to look forward. It's time to move on.
This is a sellout, certainly on fishing. I cannot believe that instead of getting better terms on fishing, we've got worse terms. I was worried that he was going to come back with 3 years for the next negotiation. It's 12 years. It's going to be over a decade that we are giving away our fishing rights. That sells out so many coastal communities in the UK. It's not that we don't want the benefits of the deal. It's making sure that we pay the right price for it. And just giving away so much for small improvements, in my view, is not worth it. That's why we call it a surrender deal.
We reflected on the deal and how it's gone down with STV's Westminster correspondent, Gourtsoyannis. Paris, how significant do you think this is for UK-EU relations and for the UK economy?
Well, Colin, I think this is a big milestone. You and I have covered a lot of Brexit talks in the past. They were ultimately about a divorce. They could be quite fraught and tense. This was about bringing the two sides together. The negotiations went pretty smoothly, secretly in the background. And, you know, even though the negotiations went past midnight last night, it was always clear that the choreography of today was going to be about both sides declaring victory. There's going to be real economic benefit from this deal, but most significantly, for the first time, the direction of movement has changed. There's a prospect of the UK and EU getting even closer still on defence and on mobility, movement of people. There's going to be, the UK is going to potentially rejoin the Erasmus student exchange scheme, and there could be an even wider deal on youth mobility after that too.
And how does this play politically for the Prime Minister?
Yeah, well, Keir Starmer wants this deal to be seen alongside the ones he's already struck with India and the United States. He wants to build that narrative that he's pragmatic, he's a problem solver, he gets things done that other people haven't done before. But of course, the Conservatives and Reform are already attacking this as a betrayal of Brexit and a sellout. That's not just because the UK obviously will be taking those EU rules on trade to ease trade between the two sides, but obviously because of the question of fishing. You know, fishing communities overwhelmingly backed Brexit because they thought they would get more control of UK fishing waters. But yet again, that control has been traded for even bigger economic benefits elsewhere.
Well, this is a great deal for Scotland, and it sits alongside the two trade deals we've already done with India and with the US. None of those two trade deals have impinged upon doing this deal with the European Union, but it's great for Scottish producers, great for food and drink, great for Scottish businesses, great for consumers. And I think it's a great deal we need to get on now and capitalising and maximising the benefits from.
The fishing industry has described it as a betrayal. They are right, aren't they?
Well, there's not one additional fish will be taken out of the seas from the European Union on this deal. It keeps the deal that we had already and extends it for 12 years to give that certainty. Alongside that is a £360 million deal for coastal fishing communities so they can maximise the benefits of that through skilling and new infrastructure. But also, if you look at what's been done in terms of the trade in goods, getting away all of that red tape is what the industry have been asking us for, so they can get their perishable goods from the seas into markets in Europe as quickly as possible. That's great for consumers, great for the industry, great for business, and we should be celebrating it.
70% of the UK's fishing industry is in Scotland. The Scottish Government says you haven't consulted them. Why is that?
That is not the case. The Scottish Government have been kept informed and consulted all the way through this. The Department of Trade Secretary of State met with Angus Robertson 4 weeks ago. They were kept up to date all over the weekend.
So while this is being painted as a betrayal by people who backed Brexit, it's also being called inadequate by those who never wanted Brexit in the first place.
Well, this deal does unpick some of the damage of Brexit, but at the cost of the Scottish fishing industry, who have described it as a total capitulation and an utter betrayal. And fishing has long been used as a pawn in the Brexit negotiations, and we're very disappointed to see that happen again.
But if your government had its way, then Scotland would be part of the common fisheries policy. There wouldn't be any negotiations on quotas or access.
Well, far from that. If we were still within the European Union and hadn't been taken out against Scotland's will, there would be far more scope to negotiate and discuss. Just look in this deal alone at how EU member states were consulted as part of the process.
So Paris, Sir Keir Starmer says this is a reset in relations between the UK and the EU. But does it end the arguments over Brexit? Will we ever see an end to them?
Colin, I really don't think so. You know, not any more than we're no longer hearing about the arguments about Scottish independence, certainly from the side that wasn't happy with the result of that referendum. But as well as the politics, I think there's a real economic test for this reset for the UK-EU relationship. The number one thing that Keir Starmer wants and needs is economic growth. If he doesn't get it, he's going to continue to have to squeeze the public finances. And as long as that's the case, and he's having to make politically uncomfortable decisions there'll be those who are saying, well, why can't we get a little bit closer to our biggest trading partner to bring in that cash into the public coffers? So I think this question is one that's going to continue to be debated for years to come.
Thanks, Paris. So as we've heard, the Westminster government stands accused of selling out the fishing industry. We spoke to Elspeth MacDonald, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Elspeth MacDonald, do you think this is a bad deal for the Scottish fishing industry? How bad a deal do you think it is and why?
It's a terrible deal for the Scottish fishing industry because instead of moving next year to annual negotiations about access, when there would be some opportunity for Scots fishermen to be able to have a fairer share of the resources in our own waters, Keir Starmer has given that opportunity away, and we now find ourselves in another fixed arrangement with the EU for another 12 years with no fish.
You'll still have negotiations on quotas though, won't you?
We'll have negotiations about the total amount of fish that can be caught, but we won't be getting any more fish back from the EU to pay for this access. That's why it's such a bad deal.
The salmon farming industry, the shellfish industry, both think this is a good deal for them. It gives them more access to European markets. Are you the only losers here?
We absolutely are the losers here because I think it's important to remember that trade happens both ways. So the EU have access to the UK market, the UK has access to the EU market. Getting a better deal on border controls works for both parties, but giving up our fishing rights is a huge loss to our industry and a huge gain to the EU. So definitely we're the ones paying the price here.
What about this £360 million Coastal Communities Fund that the Prime Minister has spoken of?
Well, we're yet to see the detail of that. We have no idea how it's going to work. We have no idea how it will be distributed across the UK. And frankly, it just feels like that if you throw some money at the industry, it makes those bad deals go away. But it really doesn't soften the blow for what's been a really bad outcome of those discussions for our industry here in Scotland. But
isn't it really just a continuation for another 12 years of the post-Brexit deal you have just now?
No, it absolutely isn't, because the post-Brexit deal at the moment was a transitional one. There was a gradual transfer of quota from the EU to the UK. That's due to finish next year. After that, the TCA, the Brexit deal, would move into these annual negotiations. That would have allowed us to leverage more fish from the EU back to the UK. So it's not a continuation. The government's very keen to sell it as that, but it absolutely isn't. It's a completely different deal, and it's the EU having continued access to UK waters without paying a tail of fish in return for it.
Would you be better off as an industry if you'd stayed in the EU?
No, I don't think we would, because we still have an independent seat at the table in other international negotiations with Norway, with the Faroe Islands, where we've got really mature now bilateral relationships on fisheries. We are able to set our own fisheries management rules in our own waters. We're out of the dreaded common fisheries policy, but we haven't secured the real benefits, the control of access to our waters, the uplift in quota in waters. That has been squandered for another 12 years.
Thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.